Welcome to a Modern Nonprofit podcast, powered by the Charity CFO, your compass for creative solutions in running your nonprofit. I'm Tosha Anderson, your host and guide through this nonprofit maze. From fundraising to volunteer management, we've got your back. Join us each episode for fresh, game-changing strategies that can make a real impact. Hey, nonprofit friends, welcome back to another episode of a Modern Nonprofit podcast. I'm Tosha Anderson. I'm your host. And, I was just thinking about this weekend. I got some stats about this podcast. And we've had over 45,000 people listen to this podcast, which is kind of crazy because, as I've shared with many people, I never started this podcast with the plan of actually having a podcast. It was, I was talking to today's guest a little bit before we started hitting record, that I did this really just to capture a media for nonprofit leaders that are so busy, desperately looking for, some sort of solution to help them solve a big problem. And I find all these really cool people out there and figure out all of their different specialties and their solutions that they've come up with. And I really wanted a cool way to capture those conversations so that other people can find it. And that's how this whole A Modern Nonprofit podcast got started. And here we are. Close to 100 episodes later, over 45,000 people have listened. It's kind of crazy to me that this is all manifested into this, but I wanted to thank all of you that are listening. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, whatever time you're listening, that you've tuned in, and all the different feedback I get and stories that people have gotten a lot of success from this. So super humbling experience as I kind of reflected on that over the last week. So thank you all for listening to this and subscribing and engaging, because that's how people find these conversations, through the likes, the follows. Listen, I don't make the rules in the meta world. That's just how it works. And so thank you for that. And if you haven't already, just engage, like, follow, share, whatever, repost, so that more people can find this content. This is going to be a great conversation today. I have a new friend, Sheri Chaney Jones. She's going to talk to us about data. And before y'all freak out and immediately stop listening, hear me out. Data is a word that, I don't know about you, Sheri, like, we've been hearing so much about data. At least in my professional career, I've been working with the nonprofit space for 16 plus years, something like that. And when we think about data, we think about numbers. And a lot of times we think about data, I think historically on the financial side, maybe, or on the fundraising side, think about money coming in. Yeah. Been a huge push on program data and how do we make sense and tell our story using data. Mm-hmm. And I want to really dive into this conversation with you, Sheri, because even in my many, many years of working with so many different nonprofit organizations, it's not so much always that we have a lack of data. Sometimes we have so much data, we can't even make sense of it. Or we've collected the data, but we don't have the skill set to analyze the data and tell the story that in our guts we have. So for those of you that are listening, Sheri's going to talk to us a little more about data and how your work at SureImpact, Sheri, you are the founder and CEO of SureImpact. Your company is dedicated to making sense of all this data and leveraging that data to better tell our stories. So before we dive in, thank you for having this big, overwhelming conversation. I think for some people, when they think of this, they get immediately overwhelmed and not sure what to do with it. So thank you for taking some time out of your day and having this conversation. And I'm really passionate about this and looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Tosha. I'm always up for talking about data, and I'll share you'll see through this interview just how passionate I am because of not because of the data for its sake, but what it can do and how it can transform nonprofits and help them scale and grow their impact and why they're in business.
Yes. And I could do a whole multi-episode series on data. Because my business, while it's a CPA firm, we're accountants, we measure all of the things. And admittedly, in the past, I've found myself guilty just kind of going through the motions and doing the things. And there was a point a couple years into starting this firm and running this firm that I knew as a leader, I had to stop, have a moment of clarity, turn all the lights on, like look around and pay attention to what's actually happening. And that was really overwhelming for me to do as a leader. And sometimes I found myself very distracted by putting out the fires that come up every day, that I wasn't creating a system of collecting relevant data. And even if I was, and this is where I would say more often than not is the biggest downfall of any business leader, for-profit, nonprofit, it doesn't matter. We don't have a cadence or a system of accountability or a structure for us to pause. Let's look at the data, make sense of it, and figure out what we need to do with it. So I'm a huge junkie. I can go on and on and on about data. but we're not here to talk about me today. Let's talk about the nonprofits, and let's talk about data that you've seen in your work that's collected. And let's just fire off with my first question. So
Okay.
nonprofits, and not just nonprofits, but I've seen more and more social enterprises. So like for-profits they have a very specific mission, and we'll call those social enterprises for purposes of this conversation. How are they leveraging data? How have you seen this specifically for the donors, right? Or funders? Maybe we can use those words synonymously. Where have you seen data playing a part in that area? Because let's be honest, that's important for us as nonprofits to leverage data to get more money so we can do more things.
Yeah, well, I think there's been a significant shift over the last, I've been in basically nonprofit program evaluation, evaluating the impact of nonprofits and government social funded programs for over 2 decades. And when I first got started in this role, it was kind of thought as a luxury, like a nice to have. Only the biggest agencies were able to afford, evaluation, or maybe if you got a big federal grants or something, it required that. But what we've seen is this gradual, and now it's not even gradual anymore. I am now likening it to Y2K. Like it's here.
It's expected for everyone.
It's here, and funders are now thinking, whether it's a philanthropist, a government funder, a foundation, it really doesn't matter across the board. However you're getting your donations through your nonprofit or your grants, they're thinking more like impact investors than they are about like charitable giving or philanthropy. Maybe historical, you could just give a nice, pretty picture of, an animal or a kid or an old person or whatever. And pull on the heartstrings. And I'm not saying we don't need to focus on storytelling and stories. We absolutely do. But they want to be engines of impact. The new generation of donors want you to demonstrate to them how, if they give you $100,000, you're going to return that into the social change they're looking for your nonprofit to achieve. Right? They don't have the time and energy and effort to roll up their sleeves and solve the problems you're solving, but they want those problems solved. And so they see your money as a way to solve that problem. And data are required in order to demonstrate your social impact that you're creating to generate those returns. And something I'm sure the audiences will be really fascinated to learn is that research that we've done have found that a nonprofit who is able to quantify and communicate how they're changing lives and changing circumstances are 68% more likely to win a grant than those who are just kind of talking about what we would call outputs, which is number and served or what they did. It's really moving beyond just what you did into actually talking about results and quantifying that to your donors.
Well, I love statistics and numbers, and that, honestly, that doesn't surprise me, which kind of brings me to I don't know, some reflection on that I feel like during my time of working in the nonprofit space, which probably started back in like 2006, I absolutely agree with you. Data was a nice to have. And where there became some disparity or some clear points of division between the haves and the have-nots with respect to the nonprofit industry, I remember large funders that were funding maybe everybody, smaller organizations, larger organizations, and they started demanding data and evidence to suggest that we're actually making or moving the needle on the initiatives we're set out to do. And these larger organizations had some capability to do that, or were certainly more successful. And then it was the smaller organizations that really struggled, like with their financial management, which is how I got into starting the Charity CFO, or also on the programmatic measurement, like how many people did you serve? It's like, we didn't even have a means to collect this much data, much less analyze it to incorporate it in our storytelling, which, like you said, translates into grants. And so I love when you talked about impact investors, and it doesn't surprise me that data and evidence of that impact is going to put your organization in a much more advantageous position to get funding. So that doesn't surprise me at all. I want to chat about some of like the pitfalls or the mistakes that you've seen in presenting data. Where are we going wrong? Because what I've seen, that organizations that I work with or over the years in the past, their initiatives, it's not like we over exaggerate the need. I've seen. In other words, if we work with a certain mission and we are sharing stories, I think we're not as bold as we should be. That the statistics are actually much more sobering than probably what our storytelling conveys, whether it's working with animal abuse or the unhoused population or the mental health crisis. I mean, if you actually had data to back up your claims of this is a problem, I think data would be far more shocking for people than I think sometimes our storytelling is. Because I think sometimes what I've seen, we don't want to be too doom and gloom with our stories, but statistics and data can be really eye-opening. I don't know if that's just my gut feeling, but I'm like, we need to be more hysterical about these issues.
Yeah.
So I'm curious from your perspective, where is data, where are some of the pitfalls or where are the mistakes that you've seen?
Yeah, I think that you make a really good point about sharing the problem data. And so that's important, right? It's important to capture the hearts and minds of donors by using, publicly available data or community level census data to demonstrate the problem. But I think the pitfall, if you're going to go out and spin a problem and your nonprofit is the solution, I find that often nonprofits don't follow that back up with, and this is quantifiably how my nonprofit is solving that problem for those that we serve, right? So they might talk about the number of people they serve. They might even talk about the number of how much money they've raised to go solve this problem. But what they're not focused on is, I love this metric called cost per success. Because what it's telling your donors is if let's say you're dealing with unhoused population and you're very hard to serve populations, getting them successfully housed and thriving, that's probably going to cost a significant amount of resources. But let's not be afraid to put a number to that. Let's not be afraid to tell our donors that, it does cost us, $10,000 to rehome someone who is unhoused. And that's, if we want to get to successful outcomes, that's what it takes to get to that outcome. And I think it's sometimes to your point about being bold, we're not making the real ask and what it really takes to solve these complex problems. And in order to do that, we need to know our success rate, we need to know how much it costs, and we need to put those two things together.
You bring up a good point on bringing it back to, okay, how is my actual organization solving this problem? And what kind of came to my mind is a situation going on in California right now with the governor saying, we're going to strip all this funding. If y'all don't find a way to show me how you've made an impact with the dollars that we've given. And it's interesting, no doubt, I have to believe, although I'm not working specifically in that community and I can't speak, but I work with so many nonprofit organizations, probably some data collection going, some system of data collection, surely. But if it's not conveying, how does your actual organization that's receiving these dollars specifically play a big part into solving this crisis or whatever it might be? And when I started hearing about what's going on in California, I'm thinking, this is something to not sleep on. If California is successful in like threatening these organizations to like prove their success through data, or we're going to withhold funding, that sent shocks to me because it's just a matter of time before other funders continue to follow suit. And let's be honest, it's not like California, this is like new information. We know this has been going on for a while, but that scale with that large of a funder saying, show us the data or proof or evidence or else, I think that's going to be a trigger or domino for all organizations. And where this is really challenging are those like community-led grassroots organizations that don't have the infrastructure to do this sort of evidence collecting. Even though they're maybe the best people positioned to solve some of these problems is really challenging. I don't know. Those are just all the things going through my mind. So let's get down to like practical solutions then. How have you seen organizations collect data or share data in a way that's maybe approachable, like first steps? Like, how do we get this ball rolling?
Yeah.
and
Well,
for these small organizations.
And Tasha, I love what you mentioned or you said, because you've made an assumption that a lot of people make that we've actually been able to debunk and say that it's untrue. And that is that only the large organizations have the ability to collect and measure impact data. And our research has shown that there really is no correlation between size and budget of an organization and their ability to collect and tell an impact story related to the work that they're doing. The number one factor that predicts whether an organization, we call them impact measurement cultures or impact-centric organizations where they're focused on managing to their outcomes and their results, is the willingness and the commitment of the leaders. So what that means is if you're a $250,000 grassroots organization, all volunteer led, you can do this with your own resources, or if you're a 20 million nonprofit, you also can do this with your own resources. So it really comes down with, do we recognize that we're in the business for social change, and what we measure, we manage to, therefore we need to make sure that we're measuring. Yes, just like it's important to measure your finances data, or you might lose, like you might just not know where your next paycheck's coming from. You also need to make sure you're managing to your mission metrics as well. So I wanted to make sure we level set that like, even if you're the tiniest of nonprofits, this is in reach for you. So how do you get started, or where do you start? Our best recommendation is you don't need reams and reams and reams of data. You really only need, like when you're talking about programmatic data, you need to be tracking like elegantly, like 3 things. You need to be tracking who you're serving, what you're doing with, and some demographics, so you can talk about the communities you serve or the people you serve, because funders really like to know who you're serving, what you're doing with them, and how are they better off? And I know that's the big question, like, how do I measure how are they better off? Well, it's asking yourselves a series of questions, which is, why does your nonprofit do what it does? Why do your participants want to participate in your program, or why do they seek your services or offerings? And third is, why do your funders or donors fund you? When you answer those 3 whys, those are what you should be measuring. So you can then go talk to your donors about how, whatever it is, why they're funding you, you can communicate back to them how you're achieving those results. If it's why do people you can't change people's lives if they don't want to work with you. So understand what need the people you're serving want filled, and communicate back how you're filling that need. And then the third is, your own mission, right? The nonprofits are in a business to create some sort of change in the world. Make sure you're measuring that too. Sometimes they're all 3 the same, but sometimes they're not, especially if you're talking like health.
Go back and repeat those 3 things again, just for those that are like, shoot, I gotta like rewind.
Oh yeah. I know. I get so excited about this. So the 3 whys. Yeah.
So things you should be measuring at a minimum.
Yeah. So you should be measuring, what do you do?
What do you do?
And who are you doing it for? What services they're receiving, and how are people better off?
Gotcha.
So
I also want to rewind and touch on the thing that you said, that the number one thing that really sets people up for success, organizations up for success on those that are measuring impact, is what I'll paraphrase, the tone at the top, the leadership. And this is like a whole nother podcast I was working on yesterday, actually, this topic. And in our work too, so we're in the financial management space, right? And so many people reach out to me like, Tasha, what are the best run organizations doing? What are the most financially secure organizations doing? Like, tell us the secrets. And what you said is the number one thing on our list. We're working on this whole like principles framework of like the most successful clients we've worked with. And as much as I can say, if you get this app, or if you do this training with your team, or if you, implement this policy, this will transform your organization. It's so not the complete answer.
Yeah.
It's the willingness. What were the words that you used? I love it. It's something like the willingness and just
I said the commitment and willingness of the leaders to understand that measuring and managing to your mission is paramount. It should be non-negotiable.
Exactly. And the same would be said, I think, for other ways that we run our organizations, which I'm going off on a slight tangent here, but it's, how do we cultivate and maintain donor relationships? How do we Manage our finances. Like, how do we involve our team into, collaborative leadership? Like, how do we do all of that? How do we treat our employees? Like,
Yeah.
how do we story tell? Like, it's all the kind of the willingness and the commitment, as you said, of the
Yeah.
leadership and the culture that organization's leadership wants to set. And if you simply just say it, but you don't live and breathe it, your team knows that. Okay.
Mhm.
And they're not going to follow suit. And I love that you said that there is not a direct correlation between how large an organization is and how successful they are in capturing that information. And I'll
Mhm.
give an example because I've worked with really large organizations that maybe they have a system, a software to collect data, but I will say in my experience, sometimes we participate in the invoice creation, which is taking programmatic, outputs, if you will,
Yeah.
or data points from
Yeah.
the programmatic activities. And I don't like doing that work. Do you know why? Because garbage in, garbage out. If there is
Yeah.
not a system of accuracy and consistency and follow
Mhm.
through
Yeah.
set at that organization level, my ability to like generate a reliable invoice is completely outside of my control. And so
Yeah.
I completely believe that even really large organizations can be set up for failure if there's not this culture of really measuring impact with some level of consistency and accuracy. So
Mhm.
I love that you debunked that myth. I love debunking myths. So thank you for that. So maybe give an example, whether it's large, small client, like your favorite success story of how an organization has used impact data to enhance like donor relationships or their storytelling.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories is because it encompasses everything we talk about is
Okay.
a group called Center of Hope. They're based in Toledo, Ohio. They have after school programming in urban areas as well as some workforce development programming, and they have a visionary leader that
Mm.
definitely is data driven
Mhm.
to the T. But they started working with SureImpact to show how they were improving outcomes for kids in their after school programming. So how are they improving their readiness, or well, basically were they on or off grade level for reading and math, and how was
Okay.
after school programming enhancing that or adding to that? And
Okay.
when she was able to, her success rate wasn't, it was great, but it wasn't stellar, but it was 63%.
Mhm.
So we can argue whether that's good or bad, but that was what it was. And
Sure.
so she started to go talk to funders about their success rate, how they were measuring, how they were helping children get better, how they were using that data to make pivots into their programs.
Mm.
And just by talking to funders about all this data, now these funders are turning around and asking the other grantees or the other people asking for money, well, what's your success rate? And they're like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Right. I don't
So
know.
just by being transparent and coming to the table with, this is our success rate, these are the challenges, this is what we need to increase our success rate, um, attracted significant more resources to her organization. She's reported 50% increases year over year when she started to put data into her
Mm.
communications with donors and funders. And they just recently were able to open a brand new, beautiful after school facility for their kids.
Oh,
But
cool.
in a large part, like because of data, right? It's for
Mhm.
everything you said earlier about, your financial management, your storytelling, your
Mhm.
cultivating purpose and community around your staff, all of that, when you add data to all those efforts, actually accelerates and grows those
100%.
organizational results.
100%. And we're going to get into later like what metrics maybe you can start with, but first I think one of the things that I get pushback, at least because I've always obviously been a data numbers junkie, kind of goes with the territory of being an accountant, I suppose. But um, I think when I've talked with programmatic team members, especially that are there for the relationships, the human-centered element of their work, and I think there's sometimes a tendency to have a little bit of pushback, or if nothing else, a need to balance data-driven decision making, especially when that data is being dictated by funders
Mm-hmm.
versus more kind of a human-centered approach for either our storytelling or how we approach our programs. And this really came to a head when I worked for an organization, we put all of our metrics that we were held accountable to our
Mhm.
funders for. It was like 5 pages front and back. So
Wow.
essentially 10 pages of different
Yeah.
outcomes that we had to report out. Now, some of them were a little bit of overlap, but there were like slight variations, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's like for the specific zip code or, whatever.
Mhm.
Um, and I think there's an element, especially on the programmatic team, like how much do we want the outside world dictating what we need to measure, how we need to measure it, and where is that shifting how we operate our program
Mhm.
versus we as the providers, we'll just use the word providers, whatever it might be,
Yeah.
could be any program. We know what's best, and maybe that doesn't jive with.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, like, how do you reconcile that or balance that?
Yeah. Well, I think we've gotten as a sector, and I will be honest, I once was a government funder,
Mm.
and was the one kind of dictating or saying, like, this is what
We
we
want to
need.
see,
Well,
yeah,
but it was because we were accountable to legislature, we
taxpayers,
were accountable to federal grants. So it really was saying,
right?
like, our funding needs to be used to achieve these outcomes. Now,
Right.
our hope was that nonprofits would look at those outcomes and self-select and say, yes, my programs address those outcomes too. So that's
Mm.
a nice, and that's what I always recommend nonprofits doing, is they do the work on their own and they identify what are their, like, again, what are their whys, what problems are their programs solving, and go find the funders who are
Mhm.
aligned. So there your measurements are aligned. You're not tracking things that don't seem relevant to you,
Adding.
because
Mhm.
you're aligning what your whys with their whys, which makes a really powerful partnership. Um,
Right.
and so when they don't align, I, I think it's important to ask yourself, is this the right funder?
Right.
Or if it really is your funder is missing the mark on what they're
Mm.
asking for, then have that conversation and say, we measure this. We believe that, this outcome is actually more reflective of how we solve the community's problem than what you're
Mhm.
requiring. How do you, like, would you be open to that? Because, sometimes funders have created the measurements that they have because the nonprofits didn't have anything. So they're like, oh,
Right.
you don't have
Right.
anything. We need something. Here you go. But if a
Yeah.
nonprofit has done that work already and can go communicate to a funder on why that measure is the right measure, you
Mhm.
can actually get requirements changed. But you have to
Yeah.
do the work yourself first.
Well, and if I had to suspect, I think that's sometimes where it starts, right? That the
Mhm.
organization may not have specific data that they're tracking, and then they get funding. Okay, now we need to start tracking this, and then
Yeah.
So I'm curious to ask you, because I've had conversations like this in the past, and I don't know how much it's still the case. I've met with leaders that are nervous to track data and make sense of data because they're kind of human-centered storytelling. Like, are they actually having the impact that they want to have? Like,
Mm-hmm.
data suggests that their programming needs to be modified, changed, or scrapped. And I've
Yeah.
had conversations with leaders that are overwhelmed with the daunting task of facing the music and having to make decisions based on that, which, by the way, probably aren't going to be easy.
Yes.
Do you find that in your work when you start working with organizations that people have kind of avoided
Mhm. Yeah. I think
data?
yeah, I mean, I think it's the hidden, it's not some people will be bold enough and tell you, frankly, this is why we don't want to do it. But
Right.
I think that is the fear factor is definitely something that holds people back. And I've had people say to me, well, what if we learn that we're not as good as we think we are? And
Yes.
my result, like, I guess my answer always back to them is, don't you want to know that? Like,
You're like, no,
if you
yes
say
and no.
and I've had that experience. I actually was working for a program where we learned we were making young people worse. We didn't want
Oh
to,
no,
but we
right?
actually found that our
Ooh.
program was increasing their likelihood to go back into the juvenile justice courts
Oh no.
than if they hadn't done anything at all. Now that was hard. That was hard. No one on our program thought
Of
this was
course.
a bad program, but we learned from that and we were able to pivot and we were able to make strategic decisions.
Mm,
And if you really ask yourself, are we really about what we say we are? Then of course you want to know if you're
you
not
need to know.
effective.
You
So
need to.
that's kind of my reaction back to it, is like, I get the fear. No one likes that judgment. No one likes that, kind of that Jim Collins in Good Great says we got to
Yeah.
confront the brutal truths. Like no one likes
Yeah.
to do it, but we have
Right.
to be successful and to really, we've got a lot of, like you mentioned, there's so many needs in this, in our world and in our country, and we need nonprofit leaders to step up and say, I'm here to solve this problem, so I'm going to look at the data to make
Yeah.
sure we are.
So that's still the case, it sounds like. And I'm saying
Yeah.
that because I'm sure there are a lot of people listening or will listen that after this conversation, it's like, why are we not measuring data at the root? Like, I think
Mhm.
at the surface level, it's
Yeah.
so overwhelming. We don't know what to collect, or we don't
Yeah.
have the perfect software to collect, which by the way, I've seen people track things on Google Sheets. Like it doesn't have to be elaborate, which we can talk about that here in a sec, like practical tools to start doing it. Sometimes I think it's such a daunting task. We don't know how to like roll this out organization wide.
Mhm.
And I think that those are some more like tactical, like things that
Yeah.
at the surface level seem like barriers, but I suspect that at the root of a lot of it is what are we going to find out when we start collecting this data?
Yeah.
And how do we know that what we're concluding is in fact, accurate, or who's going to actually analyze that and create some solid conclusions there? Because yeah, I work with a lot of organizations that have had to wrestle with facing the facts. So,
Mhm.
which kind of brings me to my next point. Like, all right, let's just assume everybody's listening. It's like, okay, if we're not collecting data, or maybe we need to take an inventory of what data we are collecting based on this
Mhm.
conversation, but we're going to commit to collecting some data. Like, then there's the overwhelming step of like, oh my gosh, what data should I be collecting that's
Mhm.
most impactful? Now, you had mentioned those three things earlier. So
Yeah.
do we just repeat that again for those of us that quickly forget, like me?
Sure.
But what are some of the, beyond those three things, which if you could repeat, that'd be awesome. But
Yeah.
what other things should we be considering, or what
Mhm.
criteria should we be looking at
Yeah.
in terms of data collection?
Yeah. So the three simple things are, who are you serving? So make sure you know who they are and their
Basic
demographics.
demographics,
So,
yeah.
okay, got that. What did you do with them? Dose of intervention, dose of how did they engage with your organization? And then
Mhm.
thirdly is how are they better off? So you don't need tons of metrics around this. Just again, go back to those why do you do what you do kind of questions. And
Mhm.
that's what you should be measuring in terms of how people are better off.
Yeah.
So that's the data you need to tell a really robust impact story related
Mhm.
to your programming. Here at SureImpact, we've done our very best to take away all those surface level problems, right? We've got an
Those
easy to use
hurdles. Mhm.
software platform that allows you to track all that and analyzes all the data. But some other questions you should ask yourself once you put these systems in place, whether you're using a tool like SureImpact or Google or whatever, is to ask yourself, does what's the so what behind this information?
Mhm.
What am I
Mhm.
going to do with it? Am I
Yeah,
going to
that's a
improve
question.
my programs? Am I going to talk to my funders about it? Am I going to use it for fundraising? Like really have a
Mhm.
purpose and an intentionality of why that metric is being collected.
Mhm. Maybe that's unique for every person, but what comes to my mind is all those other things are bonuses, like additional fundraising,
Yeah.
storytelling, that sort of thing. But, sorry, a bit of a report card on how our programming is actually impacting the people we're trying to help.
Mhm.
Excuse me. The example that you just gave, where in fact we were harming, maybe that's a dramatic word, but we
Yeah.
were not having the impact we were hoping for. In fact,
Yeah.
our youth were going back into the juvenile system. And
Mhm.
so obviously that's the opposite impact that we're hoping to
Yeah.
have. And so that's like worst case scenario, I think.
Yeah.
But at least, a mirror to tell us, how are we
Yeah.
actually performing is step one, if we don't already know
Yeah.
that. And then adding all these other benefits, obviously, is a secondary, icing on the cake for
Yeah.
organizations that are tracking all of this. That's awesome. And so branching out a little bit more from program data, because I'm assuming
Mhm.
this is just typically for me, the programmatic data is like the catapult for starting to collect other data and make sense of data. It forces leadership to embrace some sort of data collection.
Mhm.
Because we're forced to, because our funders require us to now. And I think they should. I think they should. Like,
Yes,
I love the
yeah.
idea of impact investing. And I think that we need to embrace this if we
Mhm.
haven't already for many organizations. Where have you seen other organizations start expanding their data? Let's talk about KPIs that are more organizational wide. Like,
Mhm.
do you work with any of your clients? Have you seen them start with program and then now become this transformative leadership where they're
Mhm.
measuring a company scorecard and other
Yeah.
KPIs in other areas? Like, tell us how that's impacted some of your clients.
Yeah, well, maybe it's because the grass is always greener on the other side, but I find it to be that people start with the financial metrics first.
Ah,
And they start with marketing and fundraising goals and metrics, and then the programmatic
really
data is kind of the last piece to come online.
interesting.
But because of your environment, you might find it to be the opposite. But
Interesting.
I
Yeah.
think we both would agree that that balanced scorecard or that holistic view of every department should have data-driven goals, and they should be managing to those. So the programmatic team should be
Mhm.
managing to their programmatic outcomes. Finance team should be managing to their, financial outputs, marketing. So I think that
Mhm.
that's how well-run businesses operate. And this is where, nonprofits are only a tax status. They are
Mhm.
businesses
Mhm.
first, and that's
Yeah.
the fundamentals of a well-run business.
Yeah, it goes back to, what we talked about before, with just the willingness and commitment of leadership. And I would say that's true for like every element of business. Like, how successful am I going to be on fundraising? Depends on leadership. How successful am I going to be in financial management? Depends on leadership.
Yeah.
Compliance, quality in the program, leadership. Like, it all goes back to leadership, which
Yeah.
I will be the first to validate because I've been in leadership roles at nonprofit organizations before. It's a very overwhelming and daunting task on like how to create this culture of excellence in all these different areas. And I had to chuckle a little bit with like the financial management. I'm like, well, maybe we should talk to my clients about that. But I think there is really a lot of power in starting somewhere with recognizing that KPIs and data has to be part of any successful business.
Yeah.
I've had to embrace this. That's not my natural tendency. I'm more of like fly by the seat of my pants kind of person. And I've had to incorporate that in my business on specific KPIs that I know when things are completely off the rails and where I need to intervene or what that corrective action is. Um,
Mhm.
and that's true for my business. It's not just on the service side, which would be the equivalent of the programmatic side for nonprofits, but there's
Yeah.
certainly financial metrics to make sure we stay like a healthy, financially sound organization. It's
Mhm.
also on the sales and marketing side to make sure that I'm, generating new business and getting the word out. And also on the recruiting side. So, like, what is that happening? And then, of course, you have in the nonprofit world, you have donor information. And
Yeah.
what I've seen is we have all of these like really powerful tools, which I want to talk about this before we end up. I
Yeah.
see organizations continue to invest in really powerful tools. Think CRM systems, other platforms
Mhm.
integrate, some of them don't. For those that are overwhelmed with like, okay, I have all this data, I have all these tools, like how do we like almost simplify this initially
Mhm.
just to kind of get this going so that we build the habit and the structure and the consistency? You had mentioned that your team has a platform or you've worked with other
Mhm.
organizations that have very simple processes for
Mhm.
this. Describe what that might look like for people that maybe aren't doing this, or maybe they have all this other software that isn't actually doing what they had hoped it would do, which is
Yeah, I
often the
mean,
case.
yeah, I mean, that's essentially, I was happily a program, I was running a program evaluation firm and happily doing that. But it was my customers who were coming to me and saying, Sheri, we
Mhm.
love the insights your firm's providing us. What technology should we have? So you're manually
Mhm.
doing all these things. It's almost like, and I imagine this is more related to your world, but before there was all this financial software,
Yeah.
imagine, CPAs like yourself were doing, and you might still have to do a lot of manual processes for your
Mhm.
customers, but your job is so much easier if they have a
Technology.
a technology platform, right, that they're
Mhm.
using for invoicing and record keeping and all that stuff.
Right.
And so we basically said, well, there really no one has come in and built a platform that helps track impact measurement data.
Mm.
What we were finding is that nonprofits were using tools developed for fundraisers or mostly, right? When you think of
Yes.
CRM, most of them are donor databases, they're they were built for sales teams and people were modifying them to try to make them work for the nonprofit sector. And so we said, no, let's build the software that is designed for the nonprofit and that it's analyzing. So our platform analyzes impact data and in real time. So if you ever have a grant opportunity, you don't have to wait for a human to crunch
that's
the
cool.
numbers and make sense of it. You just log in and go, oh, wait, there's my impact report. I can now go and share this with my funder or put it in that grant. And it just makes life so much easier to be an impact-centric culture.
I love that it's analyzing the impact, because I think that I've worked with organizations before that have so much data, but they don't know how to analyze it.
Yeah.
They don't know how to come up with a conclusion on the impact. And so we've done all this data collection, but it's just sitting there in some sort of data warehouse, whether it's Google Sheets or files or whatever. So I love that. So we're kind of coming up on time, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time on listening to a podcast. You had mentioned that your team actually has kind of a software, and I noticed on your website that there's a free demo out there if people are interested in exploring more what the system would look like. How else might people work with you if they just want to start having the conversation about, this is what I currently have, where can you advise, consult, help us, whether that's a software deployment or something else? Where's the best place for people to find you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would invite everyone to go to SureImpact.com, SURE impact.com. And you can learn more about, we've got tons of resources and guides, and you can, contact me that way. I also love to engage with nonprofit executives on LinkedIn.
Okay.
So if you're on LinkedIn, I would encourage you to go to Sheri Chaney Jones and say, hey, I heard you on Tosha's podcast, and I will connect with you, and we can start a conversation there as well.
Awesome. I love that. So Sheri, thank you again so much for just having this conversation with us. These are one of the conversations that I think is so important, yet so overwhelming and daunting, but I think in some ways like validating. And that's honestly why this podcast is here. It's like, okay, now that you're completely overwhelmed and we've faced the music, here are some possible solutions for your organization to start doing like these best practices that I think are becoming more and more commonplace. So thank you again, Sheri, for your words of wisdom. And go to SureImpact, like you said, SURE impact.com, and connect with you on LinkedIn. So we'll make sure to include that in the show notes. So thanks again, Sheri.
Great, thank you.
And another shameless plug for engaging with this content in some way. If you found this beneficial, this conversation interesting, or at least gave you something to think about, engage with this content in some way. Share it with another nonprofit leader. Follow, subscribe wherever you're listening to this, whether it's on YouTube or one of the streaming channels. Thank you all so much for listening and making this podcast possible. We'll see you next time. Bye. That's all we have for you today. Once again, I'm Tosha Anderson with the Charity CFO, and this is a Modern Nonprofit Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to a Modern Nonprofit Podcast on all major streaming platforms so you will stay notified for when the latest episode drops, which will help you stay in the know about anything nonprofit related. Also, join our community on Facebook by searching for a Modern Nonprofit Podcast and follow us on all of our social media accounts. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.